They did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. So the response to the hypothetical crimes of the Israelites was to enslave them. And one of the things we should notice very early on in this is that the book of Exodus regards that move of enslavement as fundamentally wrong. It's like an axiomatic precondition of the narrative itself. And modern people, I suppose, don't find that surprising because we all believe that slavery is wrong. But it isn't obvious that most of the countries and nations that in the past practiced slavery regarded it as wrong. And so this invisible ethic that already permeates the narrative has a revolutionary aspect in that sense. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel.
This is another unfortunate, consistent experience of the Jewish people, is the fact that, Hashem still blesses us even when we were going through the exile. And it grieved our neighbors that when they saw us prosperous. And it still grieves our neighbors when they see us prosperous. This hasn't changed. Most of the time, if you ask most Torah-observant Jews, whose fault is it that we have this issue with our neighbors, a lot of Jews will point the finger at ourselves and say, well, we have things that we could do better. We should be keeping the Torah better. We should be learning the Torah more. We should be davening more. And that's always where it starts for us. It doesn't absolve anybody of the sins that they've committed against us. But we're not really interested in punishment. The Torah is not about punishment. It's about education. It's about improving yourself. And there's a reason for this. And the reason for this is that we're supposed to be a light to the nations. And sometimes when we're not doing our best to keep the Torah, you see, the Torah is the light that we give off. That's the light to the nations. We're not missionaries. We don't go from place to place throughout the world and say, you ought to be a Jew. You ought to keep the 7 laws of Noah. You have to, we don't try to convert people to anything. But what we do is we try to keep the Torah to a degree as best we can, where people will say, hey, there's something about that Torah. Can you teach me something about it? Because I think that's something my life needs. And that's more of the Jewish approach. And when we find that not happening, that instead of them saying, there's something about that Torah that I need, and instead we hear, oh, those Jews, they're getting rich, but we're not getting rich. What are they up to, right? So the first thing we have to do is point at ourselves and say, okay, there are areas we could improve. Now then, it's up to those who see this in their own communities to turn around and say, yeah, but we have a share in this too. We can also improve. And this is the issue, is that you can't expect just one side to make all the improvement. It's like a marriage. Both the husband and the wife have to be about improving themselves, how they treat one another, about being kind to one another. If you're not kind to one another, if you're not kind to first you have to be kind to yourself, and then you need to be kind to the other, and then you can be partners. And the nations and Israel are supposed to be partners. And it's hard to be partners when we don't trust each other. And so this is some of this affliction, is persecution and suffering, and at the hands of our neighbors, of our cousins, of other human beings. And I'm not saying that just to criticize the nations, because we Jews also recognize that we also have to do our part too.
And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. That reminds me, that part of what happened under the Nazis with work camps and in the gulags as well, right? This idea that you identify your enemies and then you sentence them to hard labor in your service against their will. And so you see this idea echoed very early in this story, and something that's definitely echoed through the 20th century.
Yeah.
So,
But there's really this idea that what the Pharaoh is doing is wants to reduce Israel to potential for Egypt, basically. And you'll see it later when he wants to get rid of the men. He just wants women. And so in this image, and it repeats even the story of Abraham, how the Pharaoh wants to take his wife. It's about taking the potential of another people and try to subjugate it to yourself.
so it's a reflection of instrumental usage.
That's right.
Yeah, and so, you can see that in people's proclivity to use one another interpersonally, because when you're talking to someone, you can decide a priori what you want from them, and then you can bend your words and your interaction so that you exploit what they have to offer for your purposes, or you can engage in honest dialogue where the purpose is mutual enrichment, and that what would you call it, instrumental end doesn't dominate. Yeah. So,
and you can experience it like at least the mystical fathers, they talk about Egypt also as representing your own passions. That is, you become a slave to something, and then you become an instrument of that thing, right? So it's like anything that you have, like you like to eat, and then you're there, and at first, when eating knows you, like when your passion knows you, then you're fine. It's in the right order. Things are in the right order. But when your passion or desires or whatever behavior you have forgets you, then you become an instrument of it. Right. Like think of a drug addict, where everything they do serves this tyrant, and so all their potential you get reduced to a potential for behavior, and that can be
so
seen
that's for a
politically
subordinate deity in some sense, and that might be your stomach or your lust. And so that's very interesting too, because the word Israel means we who struggle with God. And so what that would mean psychologically is that that which should be at the highest place, which is the part of you that's struggling with the highest, is then subordinated instrumentally to something that should be lower in the ethical hierarchy. And that could be your own inner tyranny, and it could be someone else's instrumental will, or some state's instrumental will. And that's portrayed as fundamentally inappropriate in this text.
And you'll see, and it's imaged as this idea of making bricks, and that's a reference to Babel as well.
So, one of the things you have to be careful about when it comes to reading the Torah and interpreting it and whatever else is looking for too many similes, looking for too many allegories. In Genesis chapter 2, after all the creation account, we're told that there wasn't anything growing in the Garden of Eden yet. And why wasn't there? Because there wasn't a man to work the field. And what did it mean by work? Right? There was no water, there was no man to work the field. God creates man to do the avoda, creates Adam to do his avoda. Avoda means work, by the way. But we also see that avoda actually doesn't just mean like physical labor, it also means spiritual labor. And it means that when Adam's job in the garden was to pray. And now, I know you're saying, wait a second, aren't you going back on what you said? Didn't you just say don't have too many allegories? And what I'm saying is this is actually a very real thing, because we see in the garden, what was there for Adam to do? Pick up a hoe, right? Plant things, clip branches. What avoda was it talking? What work was it talking about? And we learn later on that in Leviticus, when it talks about the Levites and the Kohanes, their work in the temple is called avoda as well, and that is the spiritual work. Melachto is like his work, and so we learn that in connection with Shabbat, that we're supposed to finish our work that we do. Sometimes it's written as servile work, and Melachto is work versus avodah, right? These are both words that refer to work, but one of them is clearly about work, physical work in this world, and that is Melachto. The other one can have both, but it mainly has a more spiritual connotation, which is avoda. And so what we do on Shabbat is we put down the physical labor, we pick up our avodah, the spiritual labor. Now, this is what the Levites and the Kohanim did, and so there's that definite connection. And so the idea is that that Adam's work in the garden was to pray. That was his work, and that's what we do on Shabbat. We spend a lot of time doing prayers on Shabbat, and here the Jewish people are put into hard labor, but it's not spiritual labor, and that's because that's what Egypt is. Egypt is not everything. I think that they were right on the one hand of saying that the Egyptian religion and all pagan and polytheistic religions ultimately drag the spiritual stuff into the physical world, and that's what Egypt does. And so that's why there becomes an attack on the gods of Egypt, the 10 plagues, is to be able to break those physical shackles so that Israel can once again engage in what our true duty is, which is the avodah, which is the spiritual